Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in Western Virginia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time you started this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these forgotten histories travel, across states, across oceans, across time itself. Let's begin. The first record appears under a different name entirely. A brittle envelope stamped with the seal of the Greenbrier County Courthouse, dated 1913. Inside, a faded photograph rested between two fragments of paper. It showed three men seated in front of a white clapboard building, their faces expressionless, their hands heavy on their laps. Behind them, a simple wooden door bore the painted image of a chapel, its steeple stark against a black square of shadow. The edges of the photograph were cracked and foxed with age, and in the margin, someone had written in pale ink, "The Brinkhurst brothers, circa 1872. No one knew who had placed it there, or why the document had been filed with criminal ledgers from the previous century. But to those who examined it, archivists, historians, even the occasional passing journalist, it felt less like a record, and more like a warning left to survive the fire. The Brinkhurst family had not been among the grand landholders of Western Virginia, nor among its desperate poor. They stood somewhere in between, a modest lineage that had owned the same small patch of soil for 2 generations, enough to keep their heads above debt, but never enough to escape the mountains. Their property lay several miles outside the township of Cliburn, along a thin road where the trees grew so closely that daylight only came through in fractured beams. Travelers who rode that way toward the end of the century remembered the air being colder there, the soil darker, more waterlogged. The Brinkhursts were known to most only by reputation, 3 brothers, Elias, Jonah, and Silas, who had inherited their father's mortuary trade and the small chapel he built beside their family home. The sign above the chapel door, according to the last census officer who visited, still read, "Brinkhurst Memorial and Undertaking." In those days, undertakers served more than one purpose. They were carpenters, embalmers, and when the roads flooded or snow closed the passes, grave diggers too. The Brinkhursts took pride in their craft, maintaining a certain dignity that the small mountain parishes relied upon. But there were whispers even then, stories about the long hours their lanterns burned in the workshop, and the carts that came and went at strange times of night. The war had left Western Virginia full of the unclaimed dead, and business was steady enough for any man with a shovel and a strong stomach. Still, the Brinkhursts seemed to live better than most. They wore pressed coats to Sunday service, owned a horse of deep grey stock, and paid their debts in full each month to the county clerk. The first to raise suspicion was a widow named Margaret Doles, who had lost her husband in a logging accident the previous winter. She told her sister that the Brinkhursts' cart had arrived to collect the body at dusk and returned long after midnight. When she asked, weeks later, to visit her husband's grave, the brothers said the ground had been too soft to bury him until the thaw. Something in their explanation unsettled her, a tone too practiced, a calm too deliberate. She wrote a letter to the local parish, asking if a priest might confirm the burial. The letter was never answered. By the spring of 1872, when the story truly begins, Western Virginia was still clawing its way out of Reconstruction. Roads washed away each spring, and bodies were buried in shallow, waterlogged soil. Few families kept written records, and fewer still could read them. What survives now, what can be traced at all, comes only from the margins. Ledger notes, anonymous testimonies, half-burned letters discovered decades later. What they show, when pieced together, is not the tale of a single crime, but of a gradual descent, a series of quiet, calculated acts that began with the dead and ended among the living. The brothers' chapel stood at the edge of a ravine, its foundation built on rock that had once been part of a mine shaft. Local men said the ground there was cursed, that the miners had sealed the tunnels after 2 men were lost to the gas. The Brinkhursts had no choice. The land had been theirs since their father's time. But many thought the air around their property carried a sour smell, especially when rain fell after a long dry spell. Neighbors spoke of hearing wagon wheels on nights when no one was expected. Horses snorted at the tree line. Dogs howled until their owners brought them indoors. It might have all been nothing, a mixture of superstition and isolation, had it not been for the disappearance of the railroad clerk. His name, As preserved in a sheriff's note was Thomas A., the surname lost to time. He had been sent from Blue Sulphur to collect freight records from Clybourne but never arrived. His horse was found grazing near the creek, saddle still on, reins tangled. A search party scoured the woods, finding only ruts in the mud that led toward the Brinkhurst property. When the sheriff questioned Elias Brinkhurst, the eldest, he claimed the man had passed by earlier in the week asking for directions to the county road. His brothers nodded in agreement. The sheriff, with little evidence and fewer men to spare, accepted the answer and moved on. But that summer, when the rains came and the earth loosened, a hand was found jutting from the soil behind the chapel fence, bones pale and clean, as though they had been buried long before. The townspeople gathered in silence as the sheriff and his men unearthed what remained. The body had been wrapped in rough cloth, the face unrecognizable, but the clerk's brass pocket watch was found among the rags. The Brinkhursts claimed the body had been a pauper's burial, a traveller who had died in their care weeks earlier. They produced a ledger, its pages smudged, recording the name John Doe and the date. The handwriting, some said, did not match Elias's own. Others said it did. No charges were filed. The county judge, himself a client of the Brinkhursts after losing a child to fever, declared the evidence insufficient. The body was reinterred in the parish graveyard. But the rumour had already taken root, that the Brinkhurst brothers did not simply bury the dead, they traded in them. Some said they sold cadavers to medical schools in the cities. Others whispered of darker uses, of bodies stripped for their teeth and jewellery before burial, of coffins filled with stone. A schoolteacher who lived near the ridge claimed she had seen lanterns moving through the trees at 2 in the morning, the shapes of men carrying something long and heavy between them. By autumn, the Brinkhursts' trade began to falter. Families from neighbouring towns chose to send their dead elsewhere. The brothers, once confident and reserved, grew withdrawn. Elias was often seen standing by the chapel fence at dusk, staring toward the road as if expecting someone. Jonah began drinking openly at the tavern in Clybourne, muttering about debts and men from Richmond who hadn't been paid. Only Silas, the youngest, seemed untouched, though those who met him described a strange detachment, as if he were always listening for something far away. The year closed without further incident. Snow came early, covering the graveyard in silence. Yet inside the Brinkhurst home, the lamp in the front window continued to burn night after night. When spring returned, a farmer ploughing a field near the creek unearthed a wooden crate. Inside were bones, not one skeleton but several, disordered and broken, wrapped in fragments of cloth marked with blackened stains. Among them, a tag from the local infirmary read, "Brinkhurst consignment received." This time the sheriff could not ignore it. He rode to the chapel, accompanied by a deputy and the county doctor. The brothers were there, standing in the doorway, as if expecting his arrival. The photograph found decades later, the one from the courthouse, is believed to have been taken that very day before the search began. They were calm, almost solemn. Elias wore his black coat buttoned to the throat. Jonah's hands were folded before him, streaked with soil. Silas, the youngest, stared directly at the camera, unflinching. Behind them, the chapel door stood open, and through it, the faint shape of the painted church could be seen. No official record describes what was found inside, only the aftermath. The sheriff's report from that week has been lost, burned, perhaps in the courthouse fire of 1884, but a fragment preserved by the doctor's estate mentions medical implements not common to rural practice and vessels containing fluid of indeterminate origin. Within a week, the Brinkhursts were gone. Their home stood empty, the horses untethered, the lamps extinguished. Neighbours said they saw wagon tracks leading west toward the mountains, and beyond that nothing. Years later, when floods swept through the ravine, the chapel's foundation collapsed, exposing the old mine shaft beneath. Inside were remnants of wood, iron hooks and glass jars sealed tight with wax. The current carried most of it away. What remains are fragments, a photograph, a ledger half burned, and a single brass pocket watch now kept under glass in the county museum. And still, when rain falls on that hollow, locals say the water rises quickly, as though the ground itself is still trying to breathe. When the floods came in 1881, nearly a decade after the Brinkhursts vanished, most of Clybourne believed their story had finally drowned with the chapel. The wooden walls, once painted white, were carried downstream and splintered against the rocks. What remained of the foundation was swallowed by mud, leaving only the crooked fence that had once marked the graveyard. For a few years, it was forgotten, another piece of mountain folklore buried under newer troubles. But history, as it often does, waits until the living have looked away before rising again. In 1896, a surveyor from Charleston was sent to the region to map the valley for a proposed rail line. His name was recorded only once in a small newspaper notice and then lost. What he found, however, ensured that the name of Brinkhurst would never fully fade. While measuring the land near the old chapel site, the surveyor struck something solid beneath the clay. He assumed it a root or a stone, but when he pried it loose, he found a length of board with nails driven through in a pattern far too precise for accident. He dug further and uncovered a sealed box, waterlogged but intact. Inside were papers, a mixture of letters, invoices, and notes written in 3 distinct hands. The handwriting matched the descriptions once given of the Brinkhurst brothers. Only a few of the pages survived long enough to be copied, but those that did tell a quiet, unnerving story, not of madness nor of evil, but of men who had learned to see the dead as ledger entries. One fragment read, "If the university will not meet the cost of transport, we must reduce the number of consignments. The bodies here decompose too fast to wait. We must prepare them sooner. Jonah believes the cold cellar will hold them. Silas disagrees. The odor rises through the floorboards." Another page, dated 2 years later, listed what appeared to be names, and 40 in all, besides sums of money and notations: half, embalmed, returned, refused. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. At the bottom of one sheet, in a darker ink, the words, "They will never know the difference." The surveyor, unnerved, brought the papers to the county courthouse. But by then, records of the Brinkhursts had been expunged or misplaced. No clerk wished to reopen the matter, and the surveyor, perhaps realizing the danger of curiosity, mailed the originals to Charleston and never returned. For the next 20 years, the papers passed quietly from one collector to another. Historians, doctors, even a private library in Baltimore. Each owner claimed the documents were proof of an unregistered trade that flourished in the years after the war, when medical colleges paid handsomely for cadavers and few questions were asked. By the turn of the century, the Brinkhursts had become a whispered name among the mountain folk. Children were warned not to play near the ravine, and travelers were told that the mists rising from it were the breath of those never properly buried. But to others, scholars, skeptics, men of science, the story was an opportunity. In 1909, a professor of anatomy from Richmond, Dr. Charles N., published a discreet pamphlet titled Rural Cadaver Procurement in Postbellum, Appalachia. He wrote of several independent undertaker families who had allegedly supplied bodies to urban colleges during the 1870s, operating beyond the law. Among the few he mentioned by name were the Brinkhursts of Western Virginia, whose removal methods were said to be both efficient and disturbingly clinical. He noted that, unlike most grave robbers, the Brinkhursts seemed to have worked directly with certain institutions, sending bodies by wagon to the nearest railway depot, disguised as medical supplies or casks of turpentine. The professor even cited a letter, long since lost, describing 3 brothers whose skill with preservation surpassed any known mortician in the region. When questioned years later, the professor admitted he had never seen the Brinkhurst documents himself, only transcripts copied by a librarian who vanished during a cholera outbreak. But his publication reawakened the legend, and soon the old families of Clyburn began to speak again of the brothers and their chapel. One woman, who claimed to be the daughter of a parish deacon, wrote to the Charleston Herald in 1910, "I remember the chapel well. My father would not allow us near it after dusk. He said the earth around it was wrong, that it never settled. One spring, when the river swelled, the ground behind the fence collapsed. We saw what lay beneath, layers of boxes, too many for a family plot. Father said to cover it again, and we never spoke of it. No one responded to her letter. But the following month, an archivist at the courthouse reported finding a small parcel inside an unmarked drawer, the same one where the Brinkhurst photograph had been stored. Within it were several items sealed in waxed paper, a strip of white cloth, a rusted scalpel, and a ring bearing the initials TA. The archivist, unsettled, noted the resemblance between the initials and those of the missing railroad clerk from 1872. He placed the items back into evidence, only to find them missing days later. The drawer was empty, the lock unbroken. That summer, a traveling journalist named Edgar Miles came through the region, drawn by whispers of the body merchants. He was a small man, pale from years of factory dust, but his notebook brimmed with questions. He interviewed the elders of Clybourne, walked the old roads, and even claimed to have spent a night near the ravine where the chapel once stood. His account, published briefly in a northern periodical, described a landscape still heavy with absence. There is no sound in that valley at night, save for the water and a faint metallic creak, as though some buried hinge still moves beneath the earth. The people speak of light under the soil, of vapors that glow and fade. They say the Brinkhurst cellar still breathes. Miles disappeared soon after the article's release. His trunk was later found in a boarding house in Wheeling, containing his clothes and a single photograph, a copy of the Brinkhurst brothers' portrait. Edges burned. For years afterward, nothing more surfaced. Yet quietly, the Brinkhurst story seeped into the folklore of Western Virginia. Farmers told of oxen refusing to plow near the old property. Preachers warned of earth too disturbed to bless. In the 1920s, a new wave of construction began in the valley. Roads, bridges, telegraph lines. During the excavation for a bridge foundation near the old creek, workers uncovered a second set of crates, preserved in clay. The foreman, expecting tools or lumber, opened one and recoiled. Inside lay a skeleton, bound with wire at the joints, each bone numbered in fading ink. The discovery was hastily concealed. A company supervisor, fearing scandal, ordered the crates buried elsewhere and the men sworn to silence. But a laborer named Matteo, an immigrant from Sicily, kept one object, a small brass tag stamped with the initials BM and the number 14. He wore it around his neck for the rest of his life, calling it his angel's coin. When his family sold his belongings decades later, the tag was donated to a local museum, where it was mistakenly catalogued as a miner's token. Only recently was the connection to the Brinkhurst legend rediscovered. Even as the years passed, the valley never seemed to settle. Trees grew crooked, and grass refused to take root where the chapel once stood. Travelers claimed their horses grew uneasy near the bend in the road, refusing to pass without coaxing. Some said they heard faint voices, not cries but murmured prayers. In 1932, a historian named Lydia Corbin arrived from Charleston to write a regional history of Greenbrier County. She had heard fragments of the Brinkhurst story since childhood and hoped to separate truth from myth. What she found instead deepened the mystery. Corbin spent 3 weeks in Clybourne, interviewing anyone old enough to remember the late century. She found a man named Paul Dent, nearly 90, who had once worked as an apprentice to the sheriff who investigated the Brinkhursts. Dent's memory was weak, but one detail remained vivid. He said the sheriff had returned from the chapel pale and trembling, muttering about shelves where no shelves should be. Dent recalled that the doctor who accompanied him burned his gloves afterward and refused to speak of what they'd seen. Corbin recorded everything, her notes describing the old man's trembling hands and distant gaze. When she later visited the courthouse archives, she requested the Brinkhurst photograph and was told it had been misplaced. 3 days later, it was found on her desk, though no one claimed to have left it there. She described the image in her journal, identical to the one found years earlier. Except for one difference, the faint outline of a fourth figure reflected in the chapel window behind the men. The shape was indistinct, almost a blur of light and shadow, but unmistakably human. Corbin's manuscript was never published. Her notes, found after her death in 1938, end abruptly with the words, "The earth remembers. Some debts are buried shallow." Since then, the Brinkhurst property has passed through countless hands, developers, surveyors, even a coal company that tried to flatten the ridge for extraction. Each attempt failed. Machinery broke without explanation, floods returned each spring, and eventually the land was abandoned once more. Today, the ravine remains untouched. No marker bears the family's name. Only the whisper of the stream, winding past the hollow, seems to keep their story alive. But occasionally, once every decade, perhaps Someone claims to find a fragment, a nail, a coin, a piece of cloth hardened by time, and always, near the edge of that forgotten valley, the ground yields something that should have stayed buried. A century after the photograph was first taken, the Brinkhursts remain neither condemned nor absolved, only suspended between the pages of history and the silence of the earth that swallowed them. By the mid-1950s, most who had known the name Brinkhurst were gone. The valley itself had changed. New roads curved above the old creek, and the small township of Clybourne had withered to a handful of houses and a single general store. The air there still felt older than the rest of the county, as if the mountains remembered what men preferred to forget. It was in 1954 that the story stirred again, quietly, in the hands of an archivist named Harold Pruitt. Pruitt was not a historian by trade but a clerk, employed by the county to restore flood-damaged files. Among the boxes sent to his office was one marked unsorted, property records. 1870s. Inside, beneath sodden pages of tax forms, lay the familiar photograph, the same one of three bearded men before a white wooden chapel. The image had darkened over the decades, the edges curled like burnt paper. When held to the light, Pruitt noticed faint writing beneath the original ink, words once erased but still visible through the layers of grime. He transcribed what he could, taken before the fall. "Keep for the record, they will come again." No one knew whose hand had written it. Curious, Pruitt began tracing the Brinkhurst file, consulting old ledgers and maps. Most had been lost to the courthouse fire, but he found one faint entry on a mining deed dated 1861, the year their father had purchased the land. It described an underground chamber, sealed with iron bars and listed under non-usable shaft. The deed was signed by a surveyor who later disappeared during the war. The discovery unsettled Pruitt, yet fascinated him. He began visiting the valley on weekends, walking the old trail where the chapel once stood. Locals told him there was nothing left, just the ravine and the scent of wet earth, but he went anyway. The first time he found nothing. The second time, only remnants of fence posts and a few sunken stones. But on the third visit, after heavy rain, the soil near the creek collapsed slightly under his step. There, beneath the roots of an old oak, he saw a plank of wood, smooth, pale, and out of place. He dug carefully with his hands until he uncovered a narrow entrance braced with iron. The opening led into darkness. The air that rose from it was cool, heavy, and tinged with something faintly chemical. Pruitt did not enter that day. He marked the spot and returned home, intending to request permission for excavation. But that night, as he reviewed his notes, he heard a steady tapping against his window, slow, deliberate, as though someone were testing the glass. He lived on the second floor of a boarding house, his window facing the street. When he looked out, there was nothing, only the empty road and the sound of rain. The following week, he convinced two colleagues to accompany him back to the site. Together, they pried open the entrance and lowered a lantern. The tunnel sloped downward into stone, roughly carved and braced with timber. The walls were damp but smooth in places, as if scraped clean. A few feet in, the tunnel widened into a chamber. There they found shelves built into the rock, each lined with glass jars sealed with wax. Inside the jars floated fragments, not specimens whole enough to identify, but pieces, bone, sinew, something that might once have been human. On the far wall hung a rusted plaque nearly eaten through, but one word could still be read: memorial. Pruitt's colleagues refused to go further. They sealed the opening and swore to report it to the authorities. Yet by the time they returned to town, the entrance had collapsed under a fresh rain. When the county sent inspectors, the ravine had already flooded. The report filed afterward listed the site as unstable terrain, sealed for safety. Pruitt left the county soon after, taking with him a few of the recovered pages and a single object, a small brass nameplate bearing the letters EB. He kept it in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. Years later, after his death, the plate was donated to the local historical society. They displayed it briefly under glass beside the photograph of the Brinkhurst brothers, noting only that both came from the same period. Visitors said the photograph seemed to darken over time, the faces fading except for the eyes, which grew clearer each year. By the 1970s, new roads and flood barriers had cut through much of the old land. Construction crews working on a drainage canal unearthed timbers from what they assumed to be an abandoned mineshaft. When one foreman entered to inspect, he returned pale, refusing to speak. His report merely stated, "No further excavation advised, one subsurface instability." The tunnel was filled with concrete and paved over, but those who worked the night shifts said they sometimes heard a hollow sound beneath the machinery, as though something still echoed under the stone. In 1989, a graduate student named Daniel Reeves visited Clybourne to research regional folklore for his thesis. Among the legends, he found repeated mention of the Brinkhurst Hollow, a place locals avoided even in daylight. Reeves, skeptical, sought out the photograph that had started it all. At the county museum, the curator showed him the original, now warped, the image nearly gone. Reeves requested permission to examine it under infrared light. What appeared beneath the fading ink startled him. Not 3 figures, but 4, as earlier witnesses had described. The fourth form, reflected in the chapel window, seemed now more defined. The outline of a man standing within the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. His face was indistinct, but the posture suggested someone. Waiting, Reeves noted the resemblance to a figure described in a 1910 letter by the deacon's daughter, the same unseen watcher she had glimpsed when the earth gave way behind the chapel. When Reeves compared the photograph to the surrounding terrain, he discovered that the spot where the chapel had once stood now lay directly beneath a new bridge embankment. The air there was colder, and his compass needle refused to settle. He spent the next 2 months gathering what remained of the Brinkhurst documents, the transcribed letters, the surveyor's notes, Lydia Corbin's unfinished manuscript. What emerged was a chilling pattern. Every generation since 1872 had someone drawn to the Brinkhurst story, and nearly all of them had vanished, fallen ill, or left without explanation. Reeves wrote in his diary, "This is not a story about the dead, but about those who look too closely at them." He never completed his thesis. His belongings were found in a motel outside Lewisburg, the bed unmade, the photograph missing from its envelope. The last entry in his notebook read, "The door is still there." After Reeves, no one pursued the case formally. The county archives closed for renovation, and the old records were boxed and moved to storage. The photograph was catalogued one final time, its location marked as unknown. Still, those who live near Clybourne speak of the valley in low tones. They say that during the heaviest rains, when the creek rises and the wind carries through the trees, you can hear a hollow ringing, like a hammer against a coffin lid, far underground. Some claim the light from passing cars catches on something metallic near the riverbank, though nothing is ever found. In 2003, a flood uncovered part of the old ravine again. A group of volunteers clearing debris found what they thought was a rusted tool chest. Inside were several glass bottles filled with clear liquid, sealed tight, labels long dissolved. One bottle cracked in the sunlight, releasing an odor so strong the men dropped it and fled. The chest was buried again the next day. The county issued no report. Today, only fragments of the Brinkhurst story remain, scattered across libraries, museums, and whispered memory. Yet each piece, when traced back, leads to the same coordinates on the old map of Western Virginia. A bend in the creek, a hollow beneath the ridge, where a chapel once stood and where the soil still breathes. Travelers who stop there describe an uncanny stillness. Birds avoid the trees. The water moves without sound. Some say they've seen a pale shimmer at dusk, the suggestion of 3 men standing by the river. Faces indistinct but posture unchanged, as if posing for a photograph that no longer exists. And in 1 or 2 cases, those who linger claim they hear a quiet voice, distant yet close, repeating words half lost to time. They will come again. Perhaps it is nothing, and the echo of old tales carried on the wind. But perhaps the past never truly releases what it holds. The Brinkhursts, it seems, built more than a chapel. They built a threshold, a line between reverence and commerce, between the sanctity of death and the greed of those who profited from it. And though their names have faded from every ledger, their trade remains a stain upon the valley's soil. If you walk the road toward Clybourne on a misted morning, you'll pass the point where the old fence once stood. The air grows colder there, and if you stop to listen, you may hear nothing at all, not even your own breath for a moment. That is where the ground remembers. That is where the story ends, or perhaps where it begins again.